Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and in today's lessons, we're going to be exploring Moses in the law and the writings and the prophets. And the first thing we need to do is define our terms. Now, nowhere from Genesis to Revelation do we read either Old or New Testament. What we call the Old Testament was referred to by the ancient Israelites as the law, the writings, and the prophets. The law would have been the first 5 books of Moses, the Torah, known as the Pentateuch in Greek. And we traditionally classify it into historical writers, but most of the works we classify as historical would have been recognized as prophetic by the ancient audience. And some of our what we call prophets, for example, the Book of Lamentations is included in the writing sections, but we're going to approach the verses in which his life and legacy is mentioned in chronological order. So the first place we're going to turn to is in the book of Joshua. Joshua was his designated successor who led the nation of Israel into the promised land, which Moses was only permitted to glance at but not enter into. Joshua and Caleb were permitted uniquely among the Exodus generation because of the 12 scouts selected as representatives from each of the tribes of Israel. They alone had the courage to counsel the camp to come in and take this nation of giants. Now, the other 10 scouts were walking by sight, not faith, and they noticed literal giants, and their cowardly counsel ultimately won over the assembly. But for not giving the wrong course of action, Joshua was rewarded with entrance into the promised land, which we began when he was 85 years old, and he lived to be 110. So there are 57 references to Moses in the book of Joshua alone. We're only going to be covering a couple, and the first place we're going to turn is the first 8 verses of the first chapter. Then we're going to comment on the 13th one, then move on. And it came to be after the death of Moses, the servant of Yahweh, that Yahweh spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, an assistant of Moses, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. So now arise, pass over this Jordan, you and all the people, to the land which I am giving to them, to the children of Israel. So the death of Moses, who was the leader of Israel throughout their 40-year Exodus wandering, necessitated that a replacement step up and fill the vacancy. Yahweh's anointed own was Joshua, and he was an assistant prior to his assuming the leadership place of Moses, and the camp of Israelites would have been parked outside of the Jordan River, which formed the western extremity of what became the nation of Israel. And every place on which the sole of your foot treads, I have given you, as I spoken to Moses. So everywhere they're going to walk henceforth belongs to them, and the geographical limitations and boundaries of the promised land were prescribed to Moses, and it was originally promised to Abraham. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, even as far as the great river, the river Perath, all the land of the Hittites, and to the great sea, towards the going down of the sun, is your border. Wilderness, whenever we find it in Scripture, it usually translates as desert. We tend to think of wilderness as forest area, untamed forest area, but in ancient terminology, it more often than not translates as desert. Lebanon was the northern country, which still is at the north of the nation of Israel. The river Perath would have, in all likelihood, been the river Euphrates, which was promised to Abraham as the eastern extremity of the promised land. Israel, to this day and age, has yet to occupy the wholeness of the land which was promised to Abraham. And the Hittites were one of the nations. They were originally from Anatolia, or Asia Minor, or the modern country of Turkey, and the Great Sea would have been the Mediterranean Sea. So everywhere there and in between is declared their own. No man is going to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I am with you. I do not fail you, nor forsake you. Now, the final sentence is referenced by the author of Hebrews in 13:5. That means we can forsake him, but he will never forsake us. And That is the nature of the covenant which the nation of Israel struggled to maintain. They ultimately forsook him, and he allowed them to go into exile, but even there he did not forsake them. And I am with you. Now, Emmanuel, of which we first read of in Isaiah 7:14, which Matthew likens to the infant incarnate Son, is his presence with us. And the book of Matthew also incidentally closes in the Great Commission with saying, I am with you always till the end of the age. So we always have his power and presence whenever we are walking in his ways and doing his mission and performing the work we are called to do. Be strong and courageous, for you are to let this people inherit the land, which I swore to their fathers to give them. Strength and courage are necessary ingredients to do anything we are called to do, anything we are chosen to do. There is no such thing as a cowardly Christian. That is a contradiction of terms. There is no such creature on God's green earth, and it often requires strength in order to lay claim to this land which had been promised to them, but it was not given to them. They still had to walk out in faith and overcome opposition through the strength and power and by prayer and staying closely connected to Yahweh and his covenant terms. Only be strong and very courageous to keep to do according to all the Torah which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it right or left, so that you act wisely, whatever you do. So in the Torah, which translates as law in the Hebrew language, these are the first 5 books of the Moses, authored by Moses, which outlines the restrictions and the standards which are to govern them as a nation, which were in operation ever since Mount Sinai. And it requires strength and courage to honor it and uphold it and maintain it, because there are many obstacles. The path is also straight and narrow in as much as the good news path is. So do not deviate it either right or left. Follow it straightly and accordingly and exactly, and do it wherever we go. So we are not absolved of following the straight and narrow wherever our circumstances or situations may place us. Do not let this book of the Torah depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you keep to do according to all that is written in it. For then you shall make your way prosperous and act wisely. So the Torah is a source of prosperity and wisdom, and if we honor and uphold it and maintain it and preserve it, we are guaranteed success and wisdom, and it's to be a daily endeavor. There's no such thing. You cannot extract the full meaning or purpose of the Bible in one reading. It's really a daily endeavor, but the Bible is distinct from nearly other work of literature in that its full meaning and beauty is revealed over repeated readings, whereas the aesthetic qualities of most works of literature exhaust themselves over repeated readings. And meditating, the Hebrew original translates as mutter, so they were not only to read it, but to reflect on it and observe and reflect and say it out loud and think on the words. And now the 13th verse of the same chapter reads, Remember the word which Moses, servant of Yahweh, commanded you, saying, Yahweh your Elohim is giving you rest, and he shall give you this land. So the gifts of rest and land are Yahweh's to give to them. They weren't anything special, as he makes plain somewhere in Deuteronomy, but they were chosen for his purpose, not on any merits of their own, simply because they were descendants of Abraham, and the word which Moses was not merely to read, but also to obey and to keep and to uphold and honor. And we're also going to turn now, as I mentioned earlier, there are 57 references to Moses in the book of Joshua, but we're only going to comment on 8:34 and 35 and then move on. And afterwards he read all the words of the Torah, the blessings and the cursings, according to all that is written in the book of the Torah. So the afterward is when he's setting up a monument in accordance to the instruction, where they offer sacrifices and they are in the midst of conquering the land. But the blessings and curses are outlined and explained in the book of the Torah. Simply put, it is blessings for obedience and cursings for disobedience, cursings, warnings, and consequences. And that's because the nation of Israel was in a state of spiritual infancy and immaturity. So the Yahweh saw fit to reward them for obedience and to punish them for disobedience. And all that is written, so the all is universal in scope, so not just cherry picking or selecting that which is written that you feel like obeying or honoring or proclaiming at the moment, but everything that is written in it, we owe it to ourselves to familiarize ourselves with the plenary scope of this book. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded, which Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, with the women and their little ones, and the sojourners who accompanied them. So he read every word there was to read to everyone in sight who had been in their assembly, all the women and even all the foreigners and even all the children. And there were holidays mandated where there would be repetitive readings of certain selections in the book of Deuteronomy. But here he read probably Genesis through Deuteronomy, we can infer. And Samuel, the first book, the 12th chapter, and the 6 through 8 verses. And Samuel said to the people, "It is Yahweh who appointed Moses and Aaron, and who brought your fathers up from the land of Egypt." So he's reminding them that Moses and Aaron was his brother who served as the high priest. It was not through their power or their strength or their merits alone which enabled them to escape and to settle as an independent nation, but it was solely through the provision and enablement of Yahweh, who was their source of strength and power. "And now stand still, so that I judge you before Yahweh concerning all the righteous acts of Yahweh, which he did to you and your fathers. When Jacob had come to Egypt, and your fathers cried out to Yahweh, then Yahweh sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers out of Egypt, and made them dwell in this place." So Jacob was moved, the father of Joseph was his favorite son, but he was the source of envy on account of his favoritism of his brothers who sold him into slavery. He wound himself in Egypt, and through a series of providential arrangements wound up as the functional equivalent of the prime minister in that company. And because he occupied such a position of trust with the Pharaoh, he allowed his family to settle as a nation within a nation. Then it eventually grew too much, and one Pharaoh saw fit to enslave them on the pretext that if a foreign invasion came, having a nation of foreigners within them their loyalty was disputable, and that was not a risk he was willing to take. But he was liberated through Moses, and Aaron was his most trusted lieutenant. That was his brother, the high priest, and it was through their leadership that they came to the place they were now in, and they shouldn't take that for granted, although by the second generation of judges we read that they already did. In 1 Kings 2, 1 through 4, these are David's parting instructions to his son and successor Solomon. "And the days of David drew near to die, and he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I am going the way of all the earth, and you shall be strong and be a man." So this reminds us of the instructions we already read in Joshua: be strong and courageous. Strength is necessary for a king in order to rule effectively. And keep the charge of Yahweh your Elohim, to walk in his ways, to keep his laws, his commandments, his justice, and his witnesses, as it is written in the Torah of Moses, so that you do wisely all that you do, and wherever you turn. This also reminds us of Joshua 1:8. The Torah is a source of wisdom. Without it, no leader could effectively rule, and the leaders in the 17th chapter of Deuteronomy were instructed to study it day, and they were commanded to have a portable copy at their disposal, because the Israelite monarchy was unique from most of its ancient Near Eastern contemporaries and competitors in that the king was subject to a higher law, whereas those of most of them around them and before them and after them were above the law, thought above the law. But all the elements and aspects of the Torah, he is instructing his son to honor and uphold, and that is the surest, most secure way to guarantee his success as ruler. So that Yahweh establishes his word which he spoke concerning me, saying, If your sons guard their way, to walk before me in truth, with all their hearts and with all their souls, saying, There is not to cease a man out of your throne of Israel. So David was promised dynasty and perpetuity in 2 Samuel 7:16. This a literal physical descendant would not remain on the physical throne of Jerusalem forever. The final one, Zedekiah, was displaced in the year 586 BM before Messiah. But the fulfillment and the answer to this promise was found in his biological descendant, the promised Messiah, who rules eternally in heaven. Now we're going to turn to 2 Kings 18:5-8, where we read of Hezekiah, the great reformer, king of Judah. He put his trust in Yahweh Elohim of Israel, and after him was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor who were before him. Now, David and Solomon survive as the standard monarchs, but they ruled over a united kingdom of Israel after Solomon's apostasy and idolatry. As we read, for the majority of his life, he did honor and uphold his end of the covenantal arrangement. He obeyed the law. He esteemed and treasured Yahweh, who blessed him in accordance. But by the 11th chapter of 1 Kings, we read that he succumbed to the idolatrous practices of his numerous, 700 in total, foreign wives who he allowed to set up shop, and he gave in to idolatry. And as punishment for this, under his son Rehoboam, the kingdom would be divided. Henceforth, Judah would remain in the control of the dynasty of David, and Hezekiah was one such ruler, and he is established here as the standard by which all others before and after are measured. And he clung to Yahweh. He did not turn away from following him, but kept his commandments, which Yahweh had commanded Moses. So the reason he was in such an exalted esteem is because he followed and kept the commandments of Yahweh, which the kings, especially the entire nation, but all the more so the kings, were especially instructed to uphold and guard and keep and embody. And these were given through Moses and passed on to all subsequent generations. And Yahweh was with him. Wherever he went, he acted wisely. And he rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. Now, though many kings took it on their own initiative to act on their own accord in the geopolitical struggle, and many of them made alliances without consulting Yahweh or listening to the prophets, but because he was with Yahweh, that is the key, he was able to do this without punishment or retribution. He smote the Philistines as far as Azah and its borders, from watchtower to walled city. So because he was obedient, he was also guaranteed military success, which could not come in the absence of obedience. And we also read of his son, Manasseh, who was his polar opposite, at least until the end of his life. We don't read of any repentance in the king's account, but we do read it in Chronicles, and I did one on that. You can type in Corey Johnston, 2 Chronicles 33, to read that even the most wicked among men it's never too late. The first is last, and the last shall be first, so it's never too late until it is, so why wait? But we read something quite different about Manasseh, his son and successor. And no more, in 21:8-9, and no more shall I cause the feet of Israel to move from the land which I gave their fathers. Only if they keep and do according to all that I have commanded them, and according to all the Torah of my servant Moses commanding them. So the Torah and the outlines and instructions remained in operation at this point, and because they were to guide and govern all the kings, and because by this point there was no consistency in the honoring of it. The fluctuation, the common pattern and cycle was that a reformer would come down and tear down the idols and altars of his predecessors, and then his son and successor would set them right back up and open up shop to the forbidden practices. And this was something which was very much manifest in the transition of power from Hezekiah to Manasseh. But they did not obey, and Manasseh led them astray to do more evil than the Gentiles whom Yahweh had destroyed before the children of Israel. So Manasseh, in fact, exceeded the nations they had displaced in their iniquity. He led the nation, and he partook and set the moral example, the immoral model for them. And we read that he sacrificed his own children on altars, and the cities were the streets were filled with blood. But we also read, true to that pattern and cycle, in the 23rd chapter, 25th through 26th verse, that another reformer came and undid much of the damage, a man by the name of Josiah. And before him there was no king like him, who turned back to Yahweh with all his heart, and with all his being, and with all his might, according to all the Torah of Moses. And after him none rose up like him. So this is something that was similarly described as Hezekiah, who we read was an unprecedented standard in the kingdom of Judah, but for whatever reason, the author of Kings saw fit to repeat. And we notice the word all repeated frequently in this verse. So he followed the law of Moses with all his faculties and all their capacities, and that was his secret to his success. However, Yahweh did not turn from the fierceness of his great wrath, which was his wrath burned against Judah, because of the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him. So even though he had a righteous replacement, the wickedness that Manasseh had set in motion would ultimately contribute to their exile some a century later. So he plagued the nation with his wickedness, and there was little even a profound reformer like Hezekiah could do at this point. And also we read in 2 Chronicles 34, 14, 15, and we're also going to read 19th. A monumental event took place in the 18th year of Josiah's rule, of which we read, "And when they brought out the silver that was brought into the house of Yahweh, Hilkiah the priest found the book of the Torah of Yahweh given by Moses." So we read that the actual physical manuscript had been lost at this point. So it had been spiritually forsaken and then physically forsaken, but it was recovered through the diligent inquiries because Josiah commanded renovation of the temple and what should happen, but they recovered the lost Torah at this point, and these would have been rarer in the pre-printing press age. It would have been a laborious task to physically copy it start to finish. Then Hilkiah responded and said to Shaphan the scribe, "I have found the book of the Torah in the house of Yahweh." And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan. So Shaphan was a scribe. He would have been in the practice of writing that which was dictated to him, also interpreting writings. And so Hilkiah was the priest, and he spreads the news and relays its discovery to the scribe, and also in the 19th verse. "And it came to be, when the king heard the words of the Torah, that he tore his garments." So the king would have been Josiah, and how we respond to the word is an accurate reflection. How we treat the God of the word is how we treat the word of God, or vice versa more appropriately. But he was moved and stimulated into the motions of ritualistic repentance at the sight and sound of this discovery, and the contents which would have been relayed to him would have stimulated a brokenness in spirit and instant conviction of his own waywardness. Even though he was righteous by the measure of man, he was still aware of his deficiencies, as most unrighteous people are not. And we also read in Daniel 9:10, this takes us to the exile. Daniel is one of the, along with Ezekiel, one of the prophets who kept the flame of prophecy alive during the exile and in Babylon. And in the 10th through 13th verse, we read, this is Daniel in prayer, "And we have not obeyed the voice of Yahweh our Elohim, to walk in his Torah, which he put before us through his servants, the prophets." So prophets were covenant enforcers of sorts. So there's a reason you don't find anything deviating from the framework of the prophets, and that's because original thought, which the prophets were certainly had the creative capacities to be their own men and have their own distinctive linguistic style, but the ideas and concepts they espouse never ever deviate from the outlines of the Torah, and to do such would have been tantamount to heresy. That's why you don't see any contradictions in any of the prophets. And that's why they found himself where Daniel now was in Babylon. That was the price of their perpetual waywardness and disobedience. "And all Israel has transgressed your Torah and torn aside so as to not obey your voice. So the curse and the oath written in the Torah of Moses, the servant of Elohim, has been poured out on us, for we sinned against us." Now the word all, whenever that word appears, it always strikes me because the universality of scope. So the entire nation of Israel was guilty, even though they had a righteous remnant through men such as Daniel. They collectively as a nation were guilty, and that is why they were punished in group punishment. "And he has confirmed his word, which he spoke against us, and against our rulers who judged us, by bringing upon us great evil. For under all the heavens there has not been done like what was done to Jerusalem." So Daniel accepts their present predicament as the righteous response to their covenantal violations. He accepts that they brought this upon themselves and that they had fully merited the punishment they were now experiencing. "As it is written in the Torah of Moses, all this evil has come upon us, and we shall have not entreated the face of Yahweh our Elohim to turn back from our wickedness and to study your truth." So the covenant and the Torah remain in effect even when they are in exile, and the way they can return to the land of promise is by studying and meditating and reflecting and obeying the terms of the covenant. And after a 70-year period, Daniel stumbles upon the prophecy of Jeremiah somewhere around this chapter. It's either in the 9th or the 11th one or somewhere in between. So he has premonition as to the length of the duration they would find themselves in. And we're going to turn to Ezra 7:6 next, which reads, This is in the early post-exilic period. Ezra was a scribe who led a revival in the city of Jerusalem, and the temple witnessed its reconstruction, and Ezra is also recognized or credited as the author of many books besides the one which bear his name. This Ezra came up from Babylon, and he was a scribe, skilled in the Torah of Moses, which Yahweh Elohim of Israel had given. And the king gave him all he asked, according to the hand of Yahweh, his Elohim, upon him. So they still would have been technically subjected to the authority of the Persian emperor, but because they cultivated a courteous relationship with them, they were amenable to persuasion, to their reasonable request to return and reconstruct their temple. Ezra was a scribe, which would have been an interpreter and a writer of the law, and he led the after Zerubbabel, one of the descendants of the royal lines. He would have been the leader of Israel, and through his leadership, they would have witnessed revival. And Nehemiah 1 through 5:9, we actually don't have time to comment on these verses, but we want to read them to you and let you form your own opinions. We also got a verse in Malachi after this. So, and I said, I pray, Yahweh my Elohim of the heavens, O great and awesome El, keeping the covenant and kindness with those who love you, and with those keeping your commandments, please let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, which I am praying before you now, day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you, and have not kept the commandments, nor the laws, nor the judgments which you commanded your servant Moses. Please remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, If you trespass, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you shall turn back to me, and keep my commandments, and do them, though you were cast out to the end of the heavens, I shall gather them from there and bring them to the place which I have chosen to make my name dwell there. And the chronologically latest reference to Moses is found in the writing of Malachi. We don't have time to comment on it, but we will read it. Verse 4, chapter 4. Remember the Torah of Moses, my servant, which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel, laws and right rulings. So that's all the time we have for today. I hope I've given you the equipment to form your own thoughts. I don't want my thoughts to be identical with your thoughts, but what I really want to do is instill in you the independence of thought to form your own conclusions and your own interpretations of Scripture. So any longer, and we run the risk of this not being duplicated in its entirety. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Stay tuned till next time. Bye-bye.